Well, good morning. We're at our shop today, and we've just received our perimeter frame for our next project, the 32 Ford 5-window. And the process that we're going to walk through today is getting it on our frame table, that the top of which represents the ground level, and everything will be built from that for ride height. And the fundamental process here will be to square the frame to the perimeter frame for the 32 to the work table. What we'll do next is we'll walk through the around the frame itself as it sits on the frame table, and talk about how to square it up and what the instruments are that we use to square it. And when we're done with that, we'll give a kind of a final on where we are with setting the motor and the transmission and squaring it to also the frame. Okay, we received our perimeter frame for the 32 5-window project, and we now have it on a frame table that was built probably 20 years ago, and we have built lots of cars on top of this. And the yellow table that you see here represents basically ground level, and everything will be built from that point upward. It makes it is less back-breaking to have it up between your waist and knees to do the work. The thing that we do is we put it in the frame on the frame table, and we use some very hardware bought simple instruments to get it square. The frame table has a center line. It's obviously level. And we set the frame on it, and we square the frame to the table. And we use things like a plumb bob based on determining a center of the frame, and then center it to the frame table. Use a carpenter's square. Use a smaller carpenter's square. We use a dead blow in case we got to move the frame just a smidgen. Tape measures are important. And today you can buy a real inexpensive angle finder, and these things are worth their weight in gold to be sure that you're at least really close from one point to the other. And then we use a level and several different sizes of level. But that said, that basically gets us to the beginning of setting it on the table and squaring it up. The last product that's really useful is to have a lot of little wood chocks laying around in order to set the frame on, that you can take and hit with a hammer and move things in order to just make minor adjustments like an 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch. We also have down here, we have a product that we built to the table, and that is to establish where the rear end will sit as far as height from the ground level, which is the top of the table. And at that juncture, when we receive our quick change, we'll put it in and we'll start aligning it and then mounting brackets and all the control links. Okay, now we've got our frame, and first thing we want to do is establish the frame's ride height to ground level. And as we've mentioned before, the surface of the frame table is what we consider ground level, and everything is built off of that table and a center line that is established on that table. So the next thing when you get it onto the table is to get yourself a lot of little wood blocks. And we've got some that we've used before, like on our Falcon over here. The last car built on this frame table was our Falcon race car. And these blocks end up having shims added to them in order to establish the bottom of the frame, its dimension, to the top of the frame table, which will be ultimately our ride height as far as the finished product goes. And what we do with that is we establish a center. Of course, the frame table has a center, but then we establish a center down through the chassis itself, the perimeter frame, and then we square that to the table using plumb bob and level and carpenter square. And once we've established that, even in a loose situation, we then, in our next process, we will anchor that so that things can't move freely. If somebody bumps it and then you don't notice that, or doesn't do it deliberately, but ends up backing into it with something and moves the frame on the table, it makes every dimension from there wrong. So we've got to constantly check that and be sure that we haven't moved the frame as it's centered up and leveled to the table. Okay, what we have now is that we've got our frame on the table, we've got the frame centered, and we've got it leveled to where we expect the ride height to be. Our next event is to set an engine that represents the motor that's going in the finished car into the frame with a dummy transmission attached to it. In our case here, we have an Ardun flathead motor which has been replicated out of plastic, and we have a couple of pieces that will be part of the new engine when it's finished, and that is an exact example of the oil pan, the starter, and then a finned aluminum oil pan that goes on the bottom of the transmission. All those play a role in determining how that motor has to sit in the car, so that when the body comes to it and the radiator gets mounted, we have everything in a position that is going to accept the new motor. Now, one of the things that's different about this is we're adapting an automatic transmission to an Ardun motor, which is a modified flathead engine, and Cap in California made that for us. The other thing is we have a mock-up of where the front pulley is going to end up on the final engine, and that establishes how far away from the radiator we're going to be when we mount the radiator. Now, with the Ardun motor, we have had to lengthen the wheelbase by 2 inches, move the radiator by 2 inches in order to get these Ardun overhead valve hemispherical heads that are on a replica flathead to get it in the engine bay without disturbing the firewall. One of the things that I wanted to be sure was that we were not going to cut the firewall unnecessarily and replace the artistic work that was put into making the firewall way back in the day. Okay, we've got the dummy motor sitting in the frame. We've got the frame leveled and roughly in position for our ride height. And the next most important thing in particular is that the engine is set in such a way that it's going to have appropriate ground clearance. And in our case, we established 5 inches as a adequate ground clearance. Once we've done that, that also helps determine the position of the automatic transmission and then ultimately the drive shaft. But a very important element to this for me is I always like the valve covers to be approximately and very close to being level with the frame as it goes through the engine bay. Having motors hanging down or cocked up in the air has never been one of my loves of putting motors in cars, and typically you can do that with these. It just then predetermines how your drive shaft is going to shake out going to the rear end. But that's pretty much it as far as the most important thing is to establish that ground clearance under the oil pan so that, heaven forbid, you hit an armadillo and it drains all the oil out of the motor and you're sitting on the side of the road with an Ardun flathead out in the middle of nowhere and there are no parts. Well, the transmission that we had discussed before, this, of course, this is old technology. They quit making the flathead motors in approximately 53. There was some extension in France of using them longer, but we're taking a modern automatic transmission, in this case a 200 R4, and we are mating it to the back of a 1950 flathead block, And Wilcap makes this adapter that picks up the proper starter. It uses a Chrysler high gear reduction starter, and then this adapter, and then the automatic transmission, and all that is positioned at this moment. And I say use the word approximately. It might be a 1/16 of an inch off or an 1/8, and which, by the way, an 1/8 of an inch is pretty much our tolerance. If you're within that, there's a lot of slop in motor mounts. There's a lot of slop in transmission mounts, and once that's done, once you have that in the position, it pretty much predetermines what we have to do to get the drive shaft. Now, the boys that built the perimeter frame, they had no idea of this makeup of the Ardun motor, flathead, and the automatic. And what we have now, in maintaining our ground clearance, what we have is we're going to have to take this cross member and we're going to either have to loop it down or loop it over. Probably going to loop it down and let the drive shaft go through here, and the loop down prevents us from having to cut any more out of the floor in order to get the drive shaft to the rear end. All right, in our next event, what we're going to have, and these parts are on the way to us, is that we're going to have the dropped axle spring and the radius rods for the front suspension that we're going to be able to use where we are now on the frame table and the ride height to temporarily install and get that position. And then by then also we will have the Eilerman quick change rear, actually I said Eilerman, it's a Winters quick change rear end that we will set into these V blocks that will establish its location to, again, the ground level. And we're probably going to have to make a modification to the frame on that, because the typical quick change rear end has a long back end, and probably we're going to have to notch this, which is no big deal, and we'll have to put a hoop in that and a couple of pieces to strengthen it in order to have clearance to the body. But that will be in our next event.